Good afternoon. It's nice to see you, and it's nice to be seen in this beautiful church. Thank you for coming, those of you who are with us here in the sanctuary of Brown Memorial Church, and thanks to everybody who's tuning in on Zoom. My name is Tom Hall. I'm the music director emeritus of the Baltimore Choral Art Society, and the Choral Art Society has had our administrative offices here at Brown Memorial since 1982. We have a wonderful, long-standing relationship with the church. I'm also the host of Midday on WYPR, the NPR affiliate here in Baltimore, and I am delighted to have been asked to serve as our Master of Ceremonies today for this wonderful concert that Michael Britt has put together to celebrate what happened 90 years ago, on April 26, 1931, the chancel and the Skinner organ were dedicated here at Brown Memorial. So we're going to hear some wonderful music that shows the great depth and breadth of this organ, as well as the great depth and breadth of the organist, Michael Britt, who's going to play in so many different styles. One of the great things about the Skinner organ here at Brown Memorial is that there have been, it's an historic instrument, and we'll learn something about the instrument today. We're going to speak with people who know about the history of organs. We're going to speak with the curator of the organ who maintains it, and we're going to speak with Mr. Skinner's grandson, who can tell us something about the Skinner family and his experience with his grandfather. But one of the great things about the organ here and the history of the organ here at Brown Memorial is that it's been accompanied by a long history of wonderful organists as well. Virgil Fox, who had an international reputation, was the organist here for nearly 10 years. When I came to town in 1982, Gene Belt was the organist here at Brown Memorial. Gene had this job for more than 50 years. John Walker, one of the great internationally acclaimed organists around the world, was here for several years, and now we're very blessed to have Michael Britt behind the keyboard here at Brown Memorial. Michael, a wonderful improviser, a wonderful player of the standard repertory, and a wonderful has a wonderful breadth because he does everything from playing worship services to accompanying silent films. So obviously those are two very different things. Some of my best friends are clergy, and I know that they're called many things. They're rarely called silent. So if you can, accompany clergy and silent films all in the same breath, you're doing pretty good. We do want to let the folks tuning in on Zoom know that if you go to your chat, you can find a copy of the program, which has not only the pieces that Michael will be playing, but also a little information about each piece. We are masked up here and socially distanced. Those of us who are going to be speaking during the program, when I interview a couple of the folks who are involved this afternoon, we have all been vaccinated, and we have been following COVID protocols, and we hope, know of course, that all of you here with us in the sanctuary will follow distancing and COVID protocols as well. It's an incredible instrument, 3,000 pipes, valued at about $4 million, but the value of something like this far exceeds anything that a monetary assignation can express. When you think about the number of people over the decades and decades who have enjoyed this instrument and those who play it for worship services, for weddings, for funerals, the way this instrument has played a part in the lives of so many people is really awe-inspiring to think about. So today we will hear lots of music that is significant to the instrument itself and significant to the people who have played here. And as I mentioned, we'll hear a lot about Ernest Skinner and the history of this great instrument. So we're going to start with some music, and Michael is going to play a piece from a concerto by Handel, a movement that was arranged by Félix Alexandre Guillemot, and it was the very first piece played on the organ at the dedication. Dr. John Elterman was the organist and director of music at Brown Memorial Church in 1931. This is what he played to introduce the organ to the audience on that day, and Michael Britt now will play to introduce our program today. How about a hand for Michael Britt? So it's now my excuse me, it's now my pleasure to introduce joining us from Boston, Massachusetts, Jonathan Ambrosino. He is a organ historian, a consultant about the construction and installation and maintenance of organs. He has lectured and spoken widely about organs and organ history throughout the United States. So Jonathan, the screen is yours. Welcome.
Okay, let me see if I can do this. I trust that works correctly. Someone will tell me if it does. I want to thank you all. Thank you particularly Michael for inviting me here to speak today. And happy 90th birthday to Opus 839. What follows is a series of images, many of which were actually taken by Ernest Skinner himself or his wife, Mabel Hastings Skinner. Oh, darn it. 1 second, please. I am such a newbie to Zoom reality here. There we go. Here we go. This is Skinner as a boy. He was born in 1866, aptly in Clarion, Pennsylvania. He was born there and not in the family's native Massachusetts because his parents, Washington and Alice Skinner, were traveling vaudeville musicians. Eventually, they gave up their traveling ways and they settled in Taunton, Mass, near the mill towns of Fall River and New Bedford.
You're not actually sharing yet.
How's that?
There we go.
Sorry, guys. Oh, how do I... There we are, right? Thanks for your patience. There's little Ernest Skinner. His parents, Alice and Washington. And here's Ernest Skinner as a young man. By this time, his family has moved to Somerville, which is a suburb of Boston. He's working for a B-grade organ builder, George Ryder, but eventually he goes to the A-grade builder in Boston, George Hutchings, in 1890. And he's so mechanically gifted that he is soon made superintendent of that factory, developing for them electric playing actions and many other technical innovations. Here he is with more money and better grooming. In 1891, he met his future wife, the beautiful Mabel Hastings, from a family in Maine. She was working in Boston at the time, and they met on a blind date. 2 years later, they were married. Here she is in her wedding dress. They were married in Bethel, Maine, where her family was from. Theirs was a deep and affectionate bond, and there are told out in all of these fantastic family photographs. In a period when one still posed stiffly for the Victorian camera, it's clear that Mabel and Ernest had other ideas. Eventually, there were children, Eugenia, Richmond, and Ruth. This is Eugenia with her mother. The Skinners loved photography so much that they even had a darkroom in the cellar and did their own developing. Hundreds of their glass plate negatives survive. And there's an impishness to this. Here's Ernest and Eugenia taking a photograph of Mabel and Richmond is already a little imp like his father. Note the train engine hat and Skinner himself outfitted as a conductor. But there was a deeply serious side to Ernest Skinner, of course. He loved, besides music and photography and his family, he loved nature, be it the mountains of New Hampshire, where they would eventually have a summer home, or in the Rockies of Denver and the far parks of the West, such as Yellowstone and Yosemite. We have hundreds of photographs and even movies he took in these places. You hear nature's grandeur in the sound of Skinner's organs and the music that he hoped his instruments would render. And finally, as befits any organ builder, Skinner loved the latest gadget. And here he is with his 1907, I believe, Winton touring car. So, as a man now in his 30s, Skinner bought out a little share of the Hutchings Organ Company in 1900, but then immediately he got out of that and founded his own firm in 1901. By 1906, he had enough business to erect this very fine factory in Dorchester, just south of Boston. In this factory, he built his first big organ, this great hall of the City of the College of New York in 1906. Here's the console. It's typical of early Skinner organs. It was mobile. The buttons in between the keyboards did not move the knobs, but they stayed fixed. But if you look at those jams, they actually folded in, and the whole thing was very mobile and compact. Business was so good that by 1914, the factory was practically doubled in size, this left section. The tall windows are for this erecting hall in which now the biggest instruments could be set up ahead of time. Here's a picture of that early New York organ. But Skinner really always evolved. And by the 20s, the consoles would look much like Brown's, with the dimensions standardized, all of the buttons moving, the knobs and coupler tablets visibly. And these became the gold standard for comfort. If you look at most modern American organs, they look like this. That's how influential Skinner was with how he developed console dimensions and controls. But it wasn't just the mechanical side, of course. Skinner was fascinated by tone, particularly in reproducing orchestral sounds from organ pipes. Here, this is his most famous one, the French horn. He patented this pipe. He's holding the pipe with his right hand, and of course, the actual instrument in his left. Eventually, particularly from the mid-20s forward, Skinner was just as interested in the traditional organ ensemble. After spending 20 years really focusing on those imitative orchestral sounds, he returned to incorporating traditional organ sounds as well. And here he is working on a 5-rank mixture. These are the aggregation of small, brilliant sounding pipes that give the organ a quintessential effect. Of course, Skinner was so bent on quality that maybe he wasn't as bent on running a sound business. A savior came in the form of this man on the left, Arthur Hudson Marks. Marks had made millions in patenting the processes for refining rubber. He retired early, but was always in love with the pipe organ. And in 1919, he essentially bought Skinner out. Marx's fascination was with player organs. And one of the first things that happened is that he had Skinner build one for his Westchester home. This is in Yorktown Heights, a home called Lock Ledge. This fascination grew to the point that Skinner even established a studio for selling player organs right on Fifth Avenue between 53rd and 54th Street, opposite St. Thomas Church, where there was a famous Skinner organ. From this studio, the company even made radio broadcasts and would communicate by postcard with fans, you might say, always making sure that the audience was kept in touch with. The rolls for these organs were recorded in another studio, actually in Boston. This is right across the street from the organ factory. So in 1927, Mr. Skinner was now 61 years old, and Mr. Marks, ever a businessman, was looking to the future and a succession plan. And he hired a man from England, G. Donald Harrison, who worked with the Willis Company, the famous Willis Company, builder of the organs at St. Paul's Cathedral, London, and many other places, to have a successor in mind. And Harrison helped Skinner nurture that love of the traditional ensemble. And I think it's agreed that the organs the two built together from 1927 to 1932, most people agree, are the apotheosis of the Skinner organ. This crested in 1929 with the creation of 4 organs for big universities, those at Michigan in Ann Arbor, Princeton University, the University of Chicago, and this one pictured, Woolsey Hall at Yale University. Of those 4 organs, only this one at Yale survives untouched, beautifully kept in shape by the curators there. And here is its grand console, really the biggest of all Skinner consoles, which is still just like this. Given the size of the organ, it's actually admirably compact. But fame extended across the Atlantic as well. Here is the installation of a player organ in a chateau in the Loire Valley for a then quite famous industrialist named Charles Badeau, an efficiency expert. The house is perhaps more famous because it's where Edward VIII married that most famous Baltimore lady, Wallis Warfield Simpson, in 1937, to the music of a Skinner organ, no less, and played by perhaps France's most famous organist, that of Marcel Dupré, here pictured at where he was for decades, Saint-Sulpice. Inside the mechanism of this organ for France, you see something of the humanity of the men and women who built these instruments. Here's one of the chest builders saying, "Bonjour, monsieur," to his French customer, or this other man compelling the people of the house to send him a letter about your wonderful country. It's hard to know whether Mr. and Mrs. Badeau ever saw this, but it's very touching all the same. The Depression, of course, came only a few months after this French organ was finished. Skinner's staff of 200 ultimately sank below 100. The times were changing and the tastes with them. As Arthur Hudson Marks looked to the future, he saw that it lay with the younger Harrison and not Mr. Skinner. Of course, Skinner was not happy with this turn of events. And seeing the handwriting on the wall, in 1929, he bought this famous music hall in Methuen, Massachusetts, about 35 miles from the center of town in Boston, that had an adjoining organ factory, the building you see here on the right. He was persuaded to stay with the Skinner Company in 1931, however, and he signed a contract that kept him in Boston another 5 years. It was during this period that the Brown Memorial organ was built, an instrument that, despite all the tensions in the factory and the harbingers of changing tastes, is still a milestone of this brilliant period of the best of both men. All of Skinner's beautiful ensemble and beautiful orchestral color, plus Harrison's focus and energy. It's such a good organ. The problem with the bad economy, however, is that there wasn't enough room for both men's visions to survive. So in 1936, Skinner departed to this factory with his son, Richmond, and he began building organs here under the name Ernest M. Skinner and Son. The most famous instrument to come from this factory was completed in 1938 for Washington Cathedral. The factory burned in 1943. The hall, with its older and much famous concert organ, it survives. Of course, by this time, Mr. Skinner was into his 70s, but he was undaunted. There was a spirit within him not easily extinguished. He continued to work, albeit in a limited way, in a few rooms of this building on the Masonic Block in Reading, Massachusetts, which is an industrial town just north of Boston. Here he is in one of the last photographs. Meanwhile, back in Boston, the Skinner Company had merged with the Aeolian Company in 1932, a builder of residence organs, very hard hit by the Depression and changing tastes. Mr. Harrison would go on to great fame. You all perhaps know of the organs in the Mormon Tabernacle, the Riverside Church in New York City. But he also gained fame for rebuilding any number of Skinner's earlier masterpieces, such as St. Thomas, New York, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, and dozens of others. But he died in 1956. The same year, the factory was cut in half, as you see it right now, by the construction of the Southeast Expressway, Interstate 93. Aeolian Skinner left these premises in 1969 and went bankrupt in 1972. The studio across the street was sold. And now all one sees of that building is the faint sign visible to those on the subway and highway alike of what once was made within these walls. But as all things tastes go, taste and time have returned to the Skinner organ, and my generation and those just before mine really has cherished these organs and promoted them, restored them, and in some cases completely revived them. Here, for example, is the interior of the Memorial Church at Harvard University, which once housed a large 1932 Skinner organ. It's visible in this portrait. Grand instrument with an English-inspired case. It was removed in 1967 as a casualty of taste for a very important mechanical action organ built by Charles Fisk of Gloucester. This organ had its day and it made a splash, but ultimately wasn't all that successful. Now Fisk have put a new organ in the gallery, and a Skinner organ has returned to the restored church in the chancel behind the screens. Here's its console, absolutely familiar as a Skinner product. And finally, there never was any Skinner organ in Dorchester, the section of Boston where all the Skinner organs were built. But now there is. In the Ashmont section of Dorchester, there's this elegant Anglo-Catholic Episcopal church, the Parish of All Saints. And behind that facade, there is now a 1929 Skinner organ that has 21 stops. Here's its console, small but elegant, and all of its internal mechanism lovingly restored, as I'm sure that Mr. Skinner would have been proud to see. So that resurgence and the great love of the Skinner organ is something that is a wonderful thing to see as we get to 2021. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. That is really just fascinating, and those photographs are just so compelling and wonderful to see. And your overview of his life is just really terrific. So thank you. I wonder if you could comment on the effect, the impact of merging the Aeolian Company with the Skinner Company. And I was reading part of a biography of Mr. Skinner by Dorothy Holden, who mentioned that in the early 1920s, there were times where Skinner had 90-some projects going on simultaneously. I mean, they were all over the place. And then by the early 30s with the Depression, he had merged with the Aeolian Company. What was the effect on the organs at that juncture?
There was both a commercial effect. The company was building about 50 organs a year through 1930. By 1935, they built 9 organs in, I think, 1935. It's an indication of just how depressed the demand was. But one of the curious things about the Depression is you would think it a very conservative moment where people would retrench into a familiar style and thus continue the Skinner style. But in fact, there was such a change in musical taste that Harrison really developed a more Baroque sounding organ. something more appropriate for the music of Bach, his contemporaries, and predecessors. And that became the focus of not only his interests, but also those of his customers. So you note a great change in the product of the Aeolian Skinner Company. Lower wind pressures, much less emphasis on orchestral imitation, and an ever greater development of the organ ensemble.
Well, thank you again, Jonathan. That's really fascinating, and we're going to now get back to some music with
Excellent.
the Skinner organ, but again, we are very grateful for your insights. Now Michael is going to play 3 pieces. The first is a Cantabile Symphonique by Camille Saint-Saëns. This was arranged by Virgil Fox, who, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the organists here at Brown Memorial. He was here from 1936 to 1945. The next piece Michael will play is the Suite in French style by Richard Ross. He was the director of music and the organist here at Brown from 1946 through 1954. We should mention that Michael was a 3-time winner of the Richard Ross Award when he was a student at the Peabody Institute studying organ. And then finally in this section we'll hear an incantation by the great French organist and composer Jean Lonlay. He lost his sight at the age of 2 and was a incredibly busy concertizer on the organ as well as composer, held some of the big jobs in France and concertized all over the world, including more than 300 concerts here in the United States. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Britt. Thank you, Michael. That's so powerful, and it's so nice to go to a concert where the seat that you're sitting in shakes while you're listening, isn't it? Best part of an organ recital. It's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Hart, who is the curator of the Brown Memorial Skinner organ. So we saw lots of examples of Skinner organs from around the country and the world. And now Michael has some pictures to show us a nice, deep, intimate look into the organ here at Brown Memorial. So first of all, Michael, as a curator, what does that entail? What are your responsibilities in that role?
Well, it's more than just tuning the organ and fixing the odd thing that goes bump. It's also being involved with the parish and decisions that are made that affect the environment of the organ, and just being in touch more and advising the church on its care, especially as far as the atmosphere goes.
You had a pretty major piece of work on the organ back in 2002, is that right?
Yes, when we first arrived here to take over the curator duties of the instrument, the entire church was undergoing a very large restoration. If you can imagine, all the walls here were at one time painted beige, and so they did this beautiful polychroming of the ceiling. They had scaffolding set up all the way to the ceiling, so a workman could go up to the top of the scaffolding and just reach up and paint the ceiling. The windows had come out and were being restored, these beautiful Tiffany windows. The Skinner organ is very much the equivalent of it's on par with Tiffany windows, if you will. And so the first things that we started doing here was sort of stabilization things. They had started this construction, but the organ wasn't being protected against the perils of construction. So in the ensuing years, we did a cleaning of the instrument that went through 4 men and an entire summer, a gross of Electrolux vacuum cleaner bags, and gallons of Murphy's oil soap for the wooden parts of the instrument. The reed registers, the oboes and trumpets and trombones, and all of the reed registers, there's 11 ranks, 11 stops of reeds. Those all went up to Connecticut to Samuel Hughes for absolutely top drawer restoration. I could think of no one better to do it. A lot of love went into the restoration of this instrument.
Well, let's take a look literally inside the organ and talk us through some of the work you did back then.
This just kind of shows a picture on the left before the cleaning, and there's actually a beautifully ponderosa pine set of solo expression shades underneath of all that dust. So the picture on the left is the before, and the one on the right is the after. Go on to the next slide, please. This is the bottom of a very large stop, the great 16-foot open diapason, and again, left and right. And we can go on to the next, please. This is the same stop on the left. Some of the tubing that was the pneumatic conveyances for the actions had deteriorated, so they just went to a handy hardware store and bought some butylene tubing. Part of our restoration was replacing the tubing with the original lead tubing, and forming all of that. Go to the next one, please.
You mentioned the term diapason. So for the non-organists in our Zoom audience and here, what is that?
Well, the diapason, for the layperson, if they heard a diapason, they would go, oh yeah, that's a pipe organ, where you might be able to hear imitative stops in the organ, other stops like flutes, trumpets, oboes, things like that. But the diapason tone, that's really the sound that anyone would identify with. That's a basis of the instrument, also tonally. Everything else is built on that.
And what do we have here? We have another before and after. Again, the pictures on the left before the work was done, the pictures on the right afterwards.
This is up in the solo division, and the metal pipe there is a gamba stop, and behind it is the flauto mirabilis, a very powerful solo flute. It's just simply before and after. If you can imagine not cleaning your room for 70 years, it might look something like this.
I think some of us have children who can certainly imagine that.
Right. Next, please. And again, this is the more cleaning before and after. This is the great division. What you're
How many divisions on this organ?
This organ has 5 divisions: the great, the choir division, the swell, and the solo, and then the pedal division, which is played, of course, with your feet. We can go on to the next. This is a 16-foot reed stop in the swell, the Waldhorn. Before and after pictures, just showing how dramatic. I think there's a file folder and duct tape involved in the picture on the left. Next, please. This is one picture here of the floor and the frame that the organ mechanism all sits on, this floor frame. But this is the pine heart floor of the solo chamber, and in this case, the portion on the right is before cleaning, and the portion on the left is after cleaning. A lot of elbow grease. This is the console. When Dr. Walker arrived here, the console had some rebuilding work done on it, where they had replaced a lot of components and so forth. And that work was perhaps not as sensitive to the original Skinner work as it should have been. So the picture on the left is before, and the picture on the right is with new keyboards, new draw stops, the cabinetry around the draw stops, the tilting tablets above the keyboards. All of that was replaced with equipment that came from vendors that made exact replicas of the original Skinner equipment. And the firm in California, Harris, that we used, bought the Aeolian Skinner dies, so their equipment looked like the original equipment, but it worked much better because the switches were of a higher quality that you need for the new solid-state control systems now. Can we have the next one, please? And this is the console again, before and after. And next, please. Again, on the left is before, and after is on the right. Showing the difference in the wiring and so forth. Next, please. This is the pedal keyboard, which was completely restored. And those little black buttons there, those are toe pistons that have combinations of stops that the organist presets. So he just simply presses one button and it can change any number of draw stops from just a few to all of them. And this is how you make rapid changes as you're playing fast passages. On the left is before. They never had a terrace on the left. The one on the right, to the right of the large pedals, that is original. The one on the left is a replica that we made. All of these components are new that you're looking at. They're all replicas. Next, please. This is the console cabinet in the shop. The old finish was stripped off, and it was finished refinished with an oil and wax finish, which allowed the grain really to stand out well, and oil and wax finishes are very serviceable in the future should you get a scratch or something on it. And we even repainted the inside of the console black again. There's very much a mechanical standard in the organ trade, and things being done in a neat and organ-like manner. It shows respect for the instrument. It makes the instrument more serviceable in the future when everything is sort of in a straight row and orderly. So we're very proud of this. Go on to the next slide, please. This is the same picture in the shop, but with the new stop terraces, cabinetry fitted in. And next, please. This is back to the 16-foot open diapason stop in the grate. These are pipes, the longest ones are over 16 feet tall. And on the left, as some of the support ties disintegrated, they would find anything that was handy. Electrical wire, cable, string, but on the right is after restoration fitted with the proper
And what are those
ties.
ties holding up?
They're holding up pipes, 16-foot pipes, and they're keeping them vertical against their support rack so that they don't fall over. Next, please. This is the very nice 16-foot trombone stop in the pedal. And those biggest pipes there are over 16 feet tall in the far corner of the picture. Again, it's before and after. And next, please. This is the solo, the very powerful solo tuba, and the reed stop. Picture on the left again is before, and on the right after cleaning, and these little things that look like the scroll on perhaps on a sardine can. That's how the stop is regulated, and those were showing quite a bit of fatigue, and so as part of their restoration, that piece of metal around that scroll area was cut out and new metal was soldered in.
What about the spots on the pipes?
The spots, the pipe metal is roughly 60% tin, 40%, 60%, lead, 40% tin. And when the molten metal is poured out to cool, those spots develop. And those spots are a rough indicator of the percentage of tin or lead in the pipe. But those spots are just part of the cooling process, and we call that spotted metal.
Technical term there.
Yes. Could we have the next slide, please? This is the swell, clarion, oboe d'amore, and vox humana after the restoration. The chest work is clean. The shellac finish on the beautiful ponderosa pine and sugar pine is all nice and clean, and it's about as close to looking new as it can get. We're very proud of this, and the organ not only needed a good top drawer restoration, but it deserves it, absolutely deserves it. And there's always work to be done in an instrument this size. There's been many different projects since 2002 and 2005 that are ongoing here. And one of the things that we did several years ago was there's a expression motor that opens and closes to swell expression shades, and that is called, it's a wiffle tree, and it has all these pneumatics that are hooked together like a wiffle tree that you use to, for a team of horses to connect them all together. And this is a very complicated piece of turn of the century technology, but it works wonderfully well. It does its job very well, and it's kind of an industry standard. People have come out with electric ones over the years, and some of those work fine, some of them work not so well, but this is the gold standard. And restoring this thing, which is much bigger than a bread box, it's about 4 or 5 feet long and 2 feet square. It's located 25 feet up in the swell chamber off of the floor. And so just getting it down from up there was quite an experience, quite a harrowing experience. Can we have the next slide, please? This just is in the floor of the choir and kind of shows you that there's some spaces that you crawl on your hands and knees through this organ.
You have a young helper there that's just the right size.
My son was 10 years old at the time. I should say also there was a couple more photos we wanted to share with you. Before and after pictures of the organ blower, which is in the basement of the assembly hall. And, oh, there they are. Wonderful. Thank you for putting those up. Again, before and after picture. And when the assembly hall was restored several years ago, Michael Britt led the charge for getting the organ blower into a better environment. Part of the stabilizing of the instrument in 2002 was the blower sat in an unconditioned cellar down there that drew its air directly from outside. So if it were 32 degrees and raining outside, that's what the blower drew in across an earthen floor. And Charlie Obrecht, in the work here in 2002, put a passive duct into this room that came out of, so it drew air from the assembly hall. And when this project came up to restore the assembly hall, Michael led the charge with having this newer, larger, serviceable blower room built with a clean environment, with filtered air that is drawing. There's a cabinet in the corner of the assembly room, and the cabinet has a metal screen on the front, and that's there just to hide the fact that that's where the air is drawn in for the organ blower. So anyway, we're very proud of this, and I thank Michael for leading the charge on that. So, are there any more, or is that it for the slides? There we are.
That's it. Well, thank you so much, Michael. This has really been a wonderful trip, literally inside the instrument, and we appreciate it. Of course, as you mentioned, the care and maintenance of this wonderful mechanical miracle as an ongoing endeavor, isn't it? I mean, it's not like you're ever done.
It is indeed, and right now, of the 3,000 pipes or so, there's 2 that are silent right now that have a couple little issues that I will get to.
I noticed that, so I'm glad you're going to get to that.
But thank you. It's been a great honor to be able to work here and do this work in this lovely space in this historic organ. And
well, thank you for sharing
so much.
your expertise. Michael Hart, everybody. So now we'll hear some more music. Michael Britt is going to play some well-known works by Charles-Marie Widor. This is in memory of Gene Belt, who I mentioned earlier was the organist here at Brown Memorial for more than 50 years. This is one of the last pieces that Gene played before he passed away. We also have a piece by Al Fedak. It's an in memoriam that Michael Britt commissioned back in 2015. At the end of the program today, Michael is going to play a piece commissioned for today's concert, a world premiere of another piece by Al Fedak. But we'll hear In Memoriam, and then we'll hear a concert samba, which was commissioned by Brown Memorial Church in honor of Dr. Walker, John Walker. Again, his very celebrated career as a teacher and a performer and a minister of music at wonderful churches, including here at Brown Memorial. So it's important to remember that Michael Britt and the church here, Brown Memorial Church, have been very instrumental in expanding the canon of organ music, not only sustaining the existing canon, but with all of the pieces that have been commissioned, the canon of music for the instrument has expanded. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Britt. again, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Britt on the organ. And now it is my great honor to introduce you to Colonel Peter Scott. He is the grandson of Ernest Skinner. Colonel Scott, welcome to Brown Memorial. Thank you so much.
Thank you for. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you. It's a great honor. So, which side of the family was your grandfather on?
On my mother's side.
And what was her name?
My mother was Ruth Alden Scott.
So did we see pictures of her earlier then when she was a little kid?
I don't think so in this slide presentation.
Okay. And did you know your grandfather well?
Oh, I did indeed. Yeah. He was 77 years old when I was 6. And my father put me on a train in Boston to go to a summer camp in New Hampshire up on Lake Winnipesaukee, an island in the lake. And I can remember how very homesick I was as a 6-year-old. But one day, quite unexpectedly, Papa, as we called him, he had a house on Lake Winnipesaukee, and he showed up at this summer camp in his mahogany speedboat to pay me a visit. And I was very appreciative. It did a great deal for my morale.
Yeah, you were a scared 6-year-old, homesick, and then Papa shows up in his speedboat. That must have been terrific.
It was indeed.
And so that's when you were a little kid, 6 years old. But as the years progressed, did you stay in touch?
Well, fast forward to 1960. I was a student at Dartmouth College, married and working part-time as an auto mechanic. I can remember that summer my wife Ann and I drove from Hanover to Duxbury to visit with our parents. And Papa at the time was very near his 100th birthday, living with my mother and father. He loved to play chess, and I enjoyed playing with him, except that he always beat me. And when he did, he'd sit back in the couch and just smile. Unfortunately, 3 months later, when I was back at Dartmouth, Papa died. I think probably I was the last person to play chess with him. He was buried next to Nana in Bethel, Maine, where they were married.
Yesterday when we met, you told me that your grandfather was a great jokester, that he really had a great sense of humor. Do you remember any of his favorite jokes?
He did like to tell jokes. There was a man in a city with which he was unfamiliar, perhaps Tom Hall, and he wanted to go to the post office. So he stopped a stranger on the sidewalk, someone like me, and asked for directions. The native said, "Sir, you're in luck. The post office is just a close walk away. You go up here the way you were going, up by that traffic light, and turn right. Then go, no, better still, go back the way you came, a couple of blocks to First Street, turn left up the hill. Probably it would be easier if you just went back 1 block, turned left. I'm sorry, sir, you can't get to the post office from here."
I mean, he sounds like not only an incredibly creative guy, but a real fun guy to be around. And he had a sense of wonder about the world and nature and of course, the mechanical world. Did people in your family understand how important he was to the organ, to the history of organ building?
Well, certainly my mother's generation did Quite frankly, I did not. Many years ago, I visited the great National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., which also houses a Skinner organ. And I introduced myself to the organist, who was very generous with his time, a real devotee of the Skinner organ, showed me about the instrument, even played some music. My only regret, that was the first time I ever saw or heard a Skinner organ, and I just regret that Papa wasn't there with me. In recent years, I drive from my home in Northern Virginia to Duxbury, Massachusetts to visit my wife's grave. And as I do, I drive through a little city called Taunton, Massachusetts. This is where it all began. This is where Papa, at age 10, saw and heard his first pipe organ. And when a few years later he was engaged as the bellows pumper. And as they say, the rest is history.
The rest is history indeed. Well, Colonel Scott, thank you so much for sharing part of this history and for sharing this wonderful event today as we commemorate the 90th anniversary of Papa's beautiful organ here at Brown Memorial.
It's been my great pleasure.
Colonel Peter Scott, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon. My name is Al Fedak, and I'd like to share with you a few words about the final piece on today's program. First, I feel incredibly honored and grateful to have been asked by Michael Britt to compose a new piece for this special occasion, the 90th anniversary of Brown Memorial's wonderful Skinner organ. Now, in the past, I'd written several choral and organ pieces for Michael and this church's fine choir, so it seemed perfectly natural for me to be approached once again for this project. But somehow, at another level, there's a sense of almost mystical inevitability at work here, at least from my own personal perspective. Over the years, I have played many Skinner organs, but my initial exposure to E.M. Skinner and his work occurred in 1971 when I enrolled at Hope College in Michigan, home to Skinner's Opus 732, a four-manual organ of 58 ranks built in 1928. I was completely awed by the sheer beauty and power of that instrument. I played it constantly, at daily chapel services and for student church on Sundays, choral and orchestral concerts, and solo recitals. I even owned an illicit key to the college chapel and would lock myself in after hours for late-night extended practice sessions. And every time I sat down to play, I would discover new combinations of sounds and colors and new ways to use them. More recently, since 2003, I've been blessed with daily access to a virtual twin of the Skinner organ that I played at Hope College. Westminster Presbyterian Church in Albany, New York, where I now play, houses Skinner's Opus 780, which was installed in 1929, just 1 year after Hope's Skinner. Westminster Church's instrument has a fascinating history. It was removed from the building in 1976 and spent 25 years in a nearby private home, a very large home, before being returned to the church intact and completely restored. A few years ago, Michael Britt himself played a wonderful recital on that instrument, which recently marked its own 90th anniversary. In fact, the gala concert I performed last year to celebrate that anniversary was one of the last public events to be held at Westminster Church before the current pandemic shutdown. But today, we celebrate the 90th birthday of Brown Memorial's 1931 Skinner organ, Opus 839. This instrument emerged from the Skinner shop only a couple of years after the two organs I just mentioned, and shares most of the same distinctive tone colors and design features as its older siblings. When I myself had a chance to play it a few years ago, I felt very much at home. Obviously, I never met Ernest Skinner. I was just 7 years old when he died in 1960. But I do feel a particularly close, almost spiritual connection to the man, thanks to the many years I have spent playing his instruments. I believe that one can learn a lot about the inner life of a creative person from what he or she produces and leaves behind. Ernest Skinner was clearly a genius in matters electrical, pneumatic, and mechanical, but he was an artistic genius as well. The medium in which he worked was sound, organ tone, and he was obsessed with beauty. What else can one say about a man who literally invented sounds that, until then, no one had ever even imagined? Skinner's tonal innovations were many, and some of them, like the poignant, mournful sound of his English horn, became his signature. Or his iconic French horn, which in its middle register could easily be mistaken for the brass instrument itself. Or the gentle Erzähler and Kleine Erzähler, the lush flute celeste, the gamba celeste, the haunting orchestral oboe, the corno di bassetto, and of course, the majestic Skinner tuba. The first movement of my triptych, which is the piece you're about to hear, is a trumpet rondo in which Skinner's tuba gets a chance to shine. One passage in the piece quotes the German chorale Werde munter mein Gemüte, a melody that's probably best known from its setting in Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring by J.S. Bach. So this first movement really acknowledges the work of not just one, but two musical giants, America's greatest organ builder and history's greatest organist and composer. The second movement of the triptych is an expressive elegy dedicated to the memory of Ernest M. Skinner. I felt compelled to write a musical tribute to the man whom I have admired for so long and whose work has been so central to my own musical life and career. As it is played, listen especially to the variety of tone colors. Michael has orchestrated the piece masterfully, employing some of the Skinner's most beautiful solo stops. The work's third and final movement is an introduction and toccata on the hymn tune Weiße Flaggen. In the Presbyterian hymnal, Weiße Flaggen is set to two texts, one of which is a 1966 poem by the late English hymn writer Albert Bailey, entitled When the Morning Stars Together. It's a hymn that celebrates the joys of music, both earthly and heavenly, and the role that music plays in the church's life and worship. It is also the only hymn in the book whose text specifically mentions the organ. In stanza 3, we sing, "Voice and instrument in union through the ages spoke your praise. Plain song, tuneful hymns, and anthems told your faithful, gracious ways. Choir and orchestra and organ, each a sacred offering brought, while, inspired by your own spirit, poet and composer wrought." I'd like to once again thank Michael Britt and Brown Memorial Church for giving me the opportunity to compose this new work. I also want to thank Michael for his amazing artistry and for his continuing friendship. I hope you all will enjoy this new triptych for organ.
Thank you so much. This is a very emotional day for me on many different levels. I want to first thank all of our participants, Tom Hall, Jonathan Ambrosino, Michael Hart, Colonel Peter Scott, who I'm going to get back to in a second. Like I said, Jonathan Ambrosino, Doug Adams, who assisted me at the console today, our tech gurus, Rachel Cunningham, Anastasia Kupstas up there, for all the members of our COVID Return to Brown Committee, Gail Barney, and all our volunteers. Did I forget anyone? Did I get them all? Okay. And of course, for you, our audience who came out today, and for those who are watching virtually. I also want to thank Andrew and Michelle, our pastors, and this congregation who have been so dedicated to the preservation of this remarkable musical instrument that I have the honor of playing every day. I think one of the greatest joys is having a connection to the man who built it, Colonel Peter Scott, and he got a phone call out of the blue last September. I spent my whole life on Google, and I found him, and I knew that he was around somewhere. And he has been, Peter, you've been so kind and so generous with your time. And the last 2 days, I've just had such a ball getting to know you. And what an honor to have a connection with the greatest organ builder in the 20th century, and my favorite organ in the whole world here at Brown Memorial. Thank you, Colonel Scott, so much. What an honor to have you here. Michael, and thank you, everyone. Stay safe and well. Thank you for coming, and God bless you all.
And if we could ask you to remain in your seats until the ushers dismiss you for our COVID safety protocols, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.